This is Anthony Padone for a series called SQL in 10 minutes. Today we're going to talk about Azure SQL Database in 10 minutes. Let me hit my timer. Start. Countdown. Good. Let's proceed. So we broke it down into a couple categories. We have architecture, in which we'll describe the architecture of Azure SQL Database. We'll look at the code deployment, how to deploy on Azure SQL Database, but looking at it of the structure of how it proceeds from step to step, and then basic terminology pertaining to Azure SQL Database and dependent entities around that also. Let's get started right away. So let's get into architecture. This is a very important slide, and we'll discuss it in detail and then move on. I'll just make it larger if I can. Okay. First, let's just look at the sides here, and I'll make it a little smaller again. And I'll move myself. Whoa. Okay, good. So we have a database service. Let's discuss it. Database service, tier 1, database service. Next tier is the server itself, a server tier, and then a database tier. Okay. Then we have the resources tier, and then the DB deployment. Okay, let's briefly talk about it. The thing you have to decide first, what platform are you going to use, IaaS or PaaS? Right, so I just showed that and broke it down. IaaS pertains to SQL Server within an Azure VM, and we're not going to discuss that, but I just want to show you that it does exist. We'll be discussing PaaS. Within PaaS, there's the Azure SQL broken down to the Azure SQL managed instance and a logical server, which pertains to the SQL database. We're not going to talk about managed instance. That'll be another discussion. So we're following this path there. So PaaS, Azure SQL into the logical server. So that's the server tier. It's a logical server in the sense that it doesn't really exist as a server. It's a container for the databases. And if you note here, while we're creating the logical server, we can also specify a parameter to have that logical server support elastic pools. We'll get into that next. Next comes the creation of the Azure SQL database. During that creation, there are many parameters sent to it, but the ones that we're concerned about right now is the assignment of the compute model, which is serverless and provisioned. We'll discuss that in a second. So the compute model is broken down in the compute tier, which houses the serverless assignment of serverless compute tier and the provisioned compute tier. And then the provisioned compute tier can be broken down into a single DB and elastic pool. The elastic pool is a collection of single DBs. The serverless only works with single DBs, and it houses or actually uses automatic horizontal scaling. The elastic resources, the single database will expand the compute process, and then your application will then move over to that. So let's do a real quick review. So Azure SQL Database, you have to decide what compute tier do you want. Okay, is it provisioned or serverless? I don't quite like the name serverless, but that's the way it is. So provisioned and serverless. If you choose to be provisioned, that meaning there are preset resources assigned to the single database or to the elastic pool. Again, the elastic pool is a container that contains multiple databases, and those databases use the resources assigned to the elastic pool. So there's a sharing here, the collection of single databases sharing a pool of resources. So it may appear as if the databases are expanding the use of resources, but they're not. They're just using pre-allocated resources at that particular time. And also, you can also just add single databases with their own assignment of resources into the provisioned assignment. Again, serverless. If you chose serverless, it works on just single databases. It does not work, as you can see, it doesn't work on elastic pool because it's not assigned there. And it's auto horizontal scaling. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. I want you to review that after this discussion. We'll get on to another screen here. And if I can move out of here, that would be great. Okay, move myself down. Okay, so we'll get into the code deployment. This is another view of the architecture, but how the code is utilized to create that architecture. So real quickly, we have an initialization tier, the logical server tier, and the database. Initialization is just something you have to do when you're using the code as far as the PowerShell. Connect set stuff, get stuff. So we can ignore that, but something just has to be done, period. Okay, this is very important now, the components. Okay, so we have a component for the logical server, a component for the database. As you can see, we're creating a new Azure AZ SQL server. Okay, it is a logical server. Okay, when we create that server, then we also create a firewall that's attached to this logical server. And then we also have the ability, if we choose to, it's called a decorating aggregate, meaning that I can also create an elastic pool assigned to the container, meaning if I chose to use elastic pools, the server, my logical server, will support that facility of elastic pools. So as you can see here, it's a new AZ SQL server, and we have a firewall, and if we choose to have an elastic pool, we can hook that up. Now comes the database itself. We're creating an Azure SQL database within, the housing within the container of the logical server. Also, there are many parameters. One group of them is the compute model, where you specify whether it's serverless, or provisioned. So the compute model is assigned to the database, and then that's pretty much it. And then as that database is functioning, you can also get into another class called Azure SqlDatabase Mode to look at the properties and the attributes that were assigned during the provisioning of your Azure SQL database. Let's get out of that real quickly. And we're getting to terminology. I got a little over 3 minutes. Some terms that you will hear, we'll go over them real quickly, and you can study them as after this assignment here. Real quick, the Azure SQL database terminology. Resources, basically it's called the precious triad, our infinite struggle to manage the triad of resources, which of course is the compute or the CPU, compute processor, the memory, and then I/O. IOPS throughput, anything data logs, storage, anything with the IO is that. So it's 1, 2, 3, compute, memory, IO. And again, we have you always hear about compute tier. And the compute tier, as we talked about, there's serverless and provisioned. The purchasing model, the vCore or the DTU, how you should prefer vCore. The deployment model, deployment for the database, as we talked about, single, elastic, managed, and SQL in Azure VM, which is the IaaS. And the DB service, PaaS, which houses the Azure SQL managed instance, and IaaS, which houses the SQL in Azure VM. Next, we have the service tier, which it's basically the overall architecture, availability, backup that houses the processing of your whole service. And there's basic, standard, general purpose, premium, business critical, and hyperscale. I broke it down as far as the critical storage. So the basic storage, the basic, standard, and general purpose, use the Azure storage as its critical storage. So response time may be much slower. The premium and business critical uses a local SSD for the data and logs. So therefore, there's a caching of an SSD or caching of a drive for this information, so it'll be quicker. And hyperscale is in a class all its own. It uses paging servers, which is extreme great technology to investigate. That sums it up quickly. Obviously, this is 10 minutes now, almost. Go back to this, look at the individual screens, study them, and if you can, choose to take it further. But that's our understanding and study of Azure SQL Database. Thank you for listening. I have a minute and a half left, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you. Bye-bye now.